Welcome to this explainer where we're going to reverse engineer one of the absolute most fascinating macroscopic phenomena in all of materials science. We're talking about work hardening. We're going right down to its most fundamental microscopic geometries to figure out how it works. You know, when you bend a piece of metal back and forth until it finally snaps, or when a blacksmith hammers a piece of glowing steel to make it stronger. What is actually happening down there on the atomic level? Well, today, we're going to decode the 3D geometries of 1D line defects to find out exactly that. Let's dive in. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 5 key areas. First, the mechanics of climb. Second, defining jogs and kinks. Third, the intersection problem. Fourth, the pinned screw bottleneck. And finally, tying it all together, micro to macro strength.
All right, let's jump right into section 1. The mechanics of climb, or what we can call the atomic transaction.
So, unlike glide, which is really just a dislocation sliding neatly along a plane, dislocation climb is a completely different ballgame. It strictly occurs through point defect transactions, and this creates a really clean, simple binary system. On one hand, we have positive climb, which is an upward shift triggered by vacancy annihilation, and on the other hand, we have negative climb, which is a downward shift caused by vacancy generation. You can basically think of it as the surrounding crystal lattice either swallowing an extra atom whole or spitting one right out. These atomic transactions literally force the dislocation line to shift, but by exactly one atomic plane at a time. So, if an atom from the extra half plane moves to fill a neighboring vacancy, it pulls that entire dislocation line up. But if an atom leaves that extra half plane entirely, it leaves a brand new vacancy behind and shifts the line down. It's not a sweeping motion, it's a highly localized, incredibly precise transaction. Moving on to section 2, defining jogs and kinks, breaking the straight line. Now, entire dislocation lines rarely climb all at once. I mean, doing that would require an absolutely immense, perfectly coordinated amount of energy, which just doesn't happen easily. Instead, what we see are these localized interactions with vacancies that create really sharp, precise geometric steps in the line. Think about it spatially. You're either taking the stairs to change floors entirely, or you're just navigating around a pillar while staying on the exact same floor. Let's look at that first scenario. We call these jogs. These are your out-of-plane steps. When localized dislocation climb happens, it leaves behind this permanent footprint. A jog basically acts as a structural bridge, connecting dislocation segments across parallel atomic floors. The line has literally stepped off its original slip plane and moved up or down. Conversely, we have kinks. Now, these are your in-plane steps. They shift the dislocation's position, but they remain entirely within that original slip plane. So instead of forcing a rigid line over those atomic energy peaks, what we call the Pearls-Navarro barrier, all at once, kinks actually allow the dislocation to slither forward incrementally. So they don't hinder glide at all. They actually actively assist it. They actually actively assist it. So just to recap the diagnostic differences here, jogs are those restrictive out-of-plane stairs, while kinks are the helpful in-plane pillars. But here is the absolutely crucial unifying rule between the two. Both features, despite having totally different geometries, maintain the exact identical Berber's vector as their parent line. I really want you to keep that mathematical constant in your back pocket, because it's about to cause a massive structural problem. Which brings us to section 3, the intersection problem. When dislocations collide. As materials deform, it's never just one neat little line peacefully moving along. Things get messy. Complexity scales up exponentially. Gliding dislocations inevitably intersect, and they physically cut right through each other. And these violent microscopic intersections forcefully create brand new jogs and kinks right at the exact point of collision. Now, the sudden creation of these defects triggers a critical behavioral divergence. And there's a golden rule you need to remember here. Once a jog is created, its behavior is entirely dictated by the nature of its parent dislocation. Let's look at that divergence in action. If you create a jog on an edge dislocation, honestly, it generally doesn't hinder continued glide much at all. It just sort of tags along for the ride. But if you create a jog on a screw dislocation, oh boy, it is a completely different story. It creates this severe mechanical bottleneck, totally halting movement and creating what is essentially a massive structural traffic jam. And that leads us nicely into section 4, the pinned screw bottleneck. Let's figure out why screw jogs become pinned. To really understand why this divergence happens, we have to look at the math and the geometry of this newly created step against the trajectory of the main line. When you do that, the physics become undeniably evident. The continued glide of this dislocation is now mathematically impossible. Let's break down exactly why that is. Follow the logic with me here. Step 1. The new jog segment is positioned perfectly perpendicular to the main screw dislocation line. Step 2. Because of that golden rule we talked about earlier, the jog shares the parent's parallel Burgers vector. Step 3. This is where we hit the geometric clash. Because the jog segment is strictly perpendicular to its Burgers vector, it magically acquires edge character. And finally, step 4. The conclusion. Edge dislocations can only glide on a plane that contains both their line and their Burgers vector. For this newly formed jog, that plane simply does not line up with the forward direction of the screw segment. It physically cannot glide forward. It is officially completely pinned. Which brings us to our final section. Section 5. Micro to macro strength. The architecture of hardening. You guys, this is the moment where theory becomes reality. When you bend a paperclip back and forth until it becomes just too stiff to bend anymore, you are literally feeling this exact geometric causality with your own hands. We can trace it all the way from a single pinned microscopic defect straight up to massive macroscopic resistance. Let's look at the 3 phases of how this transformation actually happens. Think of it happening in 3 phases. In phase 1, the main screw dislocation desperately wants to keep moving, so it forcibly drags that pinned jog along with it. And because the jog can't glide, it has to move via non-conservative climb, which is a massively energy-intensive process. Then in phase 2, this dragging motion leaves a literal wake of point defects, like vacancies or interstitials, just scattered throughout the lattice behind it. Finally, we hit phase 3, work hardening. All these defect trails and dragging lines create immense internal friction and trigger a massive wave of dislocation multiplication. So a literal traffic jam at the atomic level mathematically hardens the entire material against any further deformation. So what's the ultimate takeaway from this explainer? It's that work hardening isn't some abstract concept or magical property of metals. It is the direct mathematical consequence of billions of microscopic geometric bottlenecks. The macroscopic strength of a deformed metal is directly, literally authored by the geometric limitations of its microscopic jogs. We've seen how a single tiny atomic step can bring a moving dislocation line to a complete grinding halt. And we've seen how billions of those halted lines give a piece of metal its hardened strength, which leaves us with a pretty compelling thought to end on. If macroscopic strength is strictly authored by the geometric limitations of these microscopic bottlenecks, how might meticulously engineering these localized defects allow us to forge the ultra-strong advanced materials of the future? Something to think about. Thanks so much for learning with me today.